The first light of dawn painted the adobe walls of San Miguel's mission church in shades of amber and rose, but Aiyana saw none of its beauty. She had been awake since before the rooster's crow, her calloused hands already wrapped around the worn wooden handle of the church broom. The morning air carried the scent of piñon smoke from the Pueblo fires in the distance, a reminder of the home she could never return to. "Hurry up, girl," Father Santos called from the church doorway, his brown robes rustling as he adjusted his rope belt. "The congregation will arrive soon for morning prayers, and those steps must be spotless." Aiyana's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes downcast as she had learned to do. "Yes, Father," she replied in English, though the words felt like stones in her mouth. In her heart, she spoke her grandmother's name, Ciala, and felt the familiar ache of loss. She began her descent down the mission stone steps, each one worn smooth by decades of worshippers and her own daily labors. The broom scraped against the rough surface, sending small clouds of dust dancing in the early morning light. This was her penance, Father Santos had explained when she'd first arrived 2 years ago, bloodied and broken after the cavalry raid that had taken her family. This was how she would learn to be civilized, how she would earn her salvation. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. Through the settling dust, she saw a lone rider approaching on a paint horse, his silhouette dark against the brightening sky. She recognized him immediately, the man the townspeople called solitary. Jack Morrison had been drifting through San Miguel for the past month, taking odd jobs at the livery stable and the general store, always keeping to himself. He dismounted near the church's wooden fence, his movements careful and deliberate. Aiyana noticed how his hand instinctively moved to his side, where a gun should hang, though he wore no weapon. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by lines that spoke of hard living and harder choices. Grey eyes, the color of storm clouds, briefly met hers before he looked away. "Morning, miss," he said quietly, tipping his worn hat. It was more courtesy than most white men showed her. Aiyana nodded, but said nothing. Speaking to strange men was forbidden, especially for someone in her position. She continued sweeping, acutely aware of his presence as he lingered by his horse, apparently in no hurry to leave. Mrs. Whitmore's shrill voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Aiyana, why are you dawdling? These steps should have been finished an hour ago." The mayor's wife emerged from around the church corner, her bustled dress rustling with indignation. Her pale eyes swept over the scene, taking in Jack's presence with obvious disapproval. "And you," she addressed Jack with barely concealed disdain, "what business do you have loitering around God's house? If you're not here to worship, I suggest you move along." Jack's expression remained neutral, but Aiyana caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Just watering my horse, ma'am. Public well's right there." He gestured toward the stone well beside the church. "Mrs." Whitmore's lips pursed. "Well, be quick about it. We don't need your sort disturbing our peaceful morning prayers." The words hung in the air like smoke. Aiyana felt the familiar burn of humiliation, not for herself, but for the man who had shown her simple courtesy. She swept more vigorously, her movements sharp with suppressed anger. "That's enough," Mrs. Whitmore snapped at her. "You're raising dust now. Get the water bucket and scrub them properly. And mind you don't track mud into the sanctuary." As Aiyana set down the broom and turned toward the well, she heard the soft scrape of boots on stone. Jack Morrison had stepped onto the bottom step, and without a word, he picked up her broom. Their eyes met for a moment, his storm-grey gaze holding something she couldn't quite name. Defiance? Understanding? Regret? "What do you think you're doing?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose an octave. Jack didn't look at her. Instead, he began to sweep the steps with long, even strokes, working from the bottom up, while Aiyana stood frozen, water bucket in hand. The simple act was so unexpected, so quietly revolutionary, that for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "I asked you a question." Mrs. Whitmore's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Finally, Jack looked up, his expression calm. "Helping," he said simply. "Don't see any harm in that." The church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to prayer. In the distance, Aiyana could see the early worshippers making their way toward the mission, Mexican families in their Sunday best, a few Anglo settlers, and the ever-present tension that walked between them like an unwelcome third party. Father Santos appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "What's all this noise about?" he asked, his accent thick with concern. Mrs. Whitmore pointed an accusing finger at Jack. This drifter is interfering with the girl's duties. It's unseemly. What will people think?" The priest's dark eyes moved from Jack to Aiyana, taking in the scene with the careful assessment of a man who had navigated cultural waters for decades. "The steps must be clean before service begins," he said finally. "How they become clean matters less than that they are." It was a diplomatic response, but Aiyana heard the underlying message. Maintain the peace, avoid the conflict, keep everyone just satisfied enough to prevent an explosion. She had learned to read such careful neutrality in the 2 years since she'd been placed under the church's protection. Jack continued sweeping, his movements steady and unhurried. Aiyana found herself working beside him, scrubbing the stones with her wet brush, while he cleared away the debris. They worked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that forms between people who understand each other without words. When they finished, Jack handed her the broom. His fingers brushed hers for just a moment, calloused and warm. "Good day, miss," he said, touching his hat brim again. As he walked back to his horse, Aiyana felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot she'd carried for 2 years. Someone had seen her as more than just a project to be civilized, or a burden to be managed. Someone had stood beside her, if only for a few minutes, and made her feel less alone. The church bells tolled again, and the first parishioners began climbing the spotless steps. Aiyana gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to disappear into the shadows of the sanctuary, where she would spend another morning listening to sermons about salvation while scrubbing floors and polishing pews. But as she reached the church door, she couldn't resist one last look back. Jack Morrison was riding away, his paint horse picking its way carefully down the dusty street. The morning sun caught his shoulders, and for a moment he looked less like a drifter and more like a man carrying his own heavy burden. Aiyana touched the small medicine pouch hidden beneath her rough cotton dress, the one thing of her grandmother's she had managed to keep. Today it felt less like a secret shame and more like a promise that some things, no matter how hard others tried to sweep them away, would endure. 3 days had passed since Jack Morrison had picked up that broom, and the incident had spread through San Miguel like wildfire through dry grass. Aiyana could feel the weight of stares wherever she went, some curious, some disapproving, all making her skin crawl with their intensity. She knelt in the church garden, pulling weeds from between the struggling tomato plants that Father Santos insisted on growing, despite the harsh New Mexico soil. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked. The repetitive motion of her hands gave her time to think, though her thoughts were dangerous territory these days. "That girl's getting ideas above her station," came Mrs. Whitmore's voice from around the corner of the church. Aiyana froze, her hands still buried in the dirt. The woman was speaking to someone in hushed tones, but the desert air carried sound like a cruel messenger. "Now, Catherine," replied a man's voice. "Mayor Whitmore," she realized. "Don't work yourself into a state over nothing. The man helped with some sweeping, that's hardly cause for alarm." "Nothing?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice pitched higher. "Harold, you didn't see the way she looked at him. And the way he looked at her. It's improper. Dangerous even. We can't have that sort of thing in a Christian town." Aiyana's stomach twisted. She had looked at Jack Morrison, had felt something stir in her chest when he'd taken that broom, but it wasn't what Mrs. Whitmore was implying. It was recognition, the recognition of someone who understood what it meant to be an outsider, to carry shame that wasn't entirely your own. "What exactly are you suggesting we do?" the mayor asked, sounding tired. "Talk to Father Santos. Make it clear that the girl needs stricter supervision. And as for that drifter, well, perhaps it's time he moved on. Tom Brennan could have a word with him." Aiyana's hands clenched in the dirt. She had known this would happen. Any small kindness, any moment of human connection was viewed as a threat to the careful order that kept her in her place. She started to rise, intending to slip away before she was discovered, but a shadow fell across her path. "Afternoon, miss." She looked up to find Jack Morrison standing at the garden gate, his hat in his hands. His presence was so unexpected that for a moment she couldn't speak. Behind him, she could see his paint horse tied to the fence post, and beyond that, the dusty main street of San Miguel stretching toward the horizon. "You're not supposed to be here," she said quietly, glancing nervously toward the church. The Whitmore's conversation had ceased, but she could feel eyes watching from somewhere. "I know," he said, his voice low, "but I wanted to return this." He held out his hand, and in his palm lay a small piece of turquoise, a bead that had fallen from her medicine pouch during the morning's cleaning. She must have missed it in her haste to put everything away. Her breath caught. If anyone had seen that bead, if they had realized what it was. She quickly took it from his hand, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. The stone was warm from his touch. "Thank you," she whispered, tucking it safely into her dress pocket. "You shouldn't have—" "Aiyana!" Father Santos's voice boomed from the church steps. "What are you doing? Who is that man?" Jack stepped back from the gate, his expression carefully neutral. "Just asking for directions, Father. I'll be on my way." But Father Santos was already striding across the courtyard, his brown robes billowing behind him. His face was flushed with heat and something else. Concern, perhaps, or fear. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it? You're the man who was helping with the church steps." "Yes, sir." Jack's voice was respectful but not deferential. "I think it would be best if you conducted your business elsewhere. The girl has duties to attend to, and we wouldn't want to give anyone the wrong impression." The words were diplomatic, but their meaning was clear. Aiyana felt the familiar burn of humiliation, made worse by the knowledge that Jack was witnessing her diminishment. She bent back to her weeding, trying to make herself invisible. "Understood, Father," Jack said, but he didn't move immediately. Instead, he looked at Aiyana, and she felt his gaze like a physical touch. "Miss," he said formally, "I hope you have a pleasant evening." As he turned to leave, Aiyana heard Mrs. Whitmore's voice again, closer now. "Father Santos, I believe we need to discuss the girl's situation. Perhaps it's time to consider sending her to the school in Santa Fe. They have programs for her type." The words hit Aiyana like a physical blow. She had heard whispers about the government school in Santa Fe, where native children were sent to have their culture systematically erased, where they cut your hair, forbade your language, and beat you for any sign of your heritage, where children went in as themselves and came out as hollow shells in white clothing. Her hands began to shake, dirt falling from her fingers. She could hear Father Santos and Mrs. Whitmore discussing her future as if she weren't there, as if she had no say in what happened to her own life. The words seemed to blur together. For her own good, proper Christian education, complete assimilation. "I won't go." The words escaped her lips before she could stop them. The conversation ceased abruptly. Father Santos looked down at her with surprise, while Mrs. Whitmore's face darkened with anger. "Excuse me?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice was dangerously quiet. Aiyana rose to her feet, dirt still clinging to her hands. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "I said I won't go to that school. I won't let you send me there." "You won't let us?" Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "My dear child, you seem to have forgotten your place. You are here by the grace of God and the charity of this community. You have no rights, no choices. You will go where you're told, and be grateful for it." The words rang across the courtyard like a slap. Aiyana felt something break inside her, not her spirit, but the careful wall she had built around her anger. For 2 years, she had been the perfect penitent, the grateful charity case. For 2 years, she had swallowed her pride and her pain and her rage. "I am not your charity case," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I am not your project to be fixed or your soul to be saved. I am Aiyana of the Pueblo people, granddaughter of Ciala the wise woman, and I will not be erased." The silence that followed was deafening. Father Santos looked stricken. Mrs. Whitmore appeared ready to burst with indignation, and from somewhere behind them, Aiyana could hear the murmur of voices, townspeople who had gathered to witness the spectacle. "Well," Mrs. Whitmore said finally, her voice cold as winter wind, "I think that settles it. The girl clearly needs more intensive intervention than we can provide here. I'll write to the authorities in Santa Fe tomorrow." As she turned to leave, Aiyana caught sight of Jack Morrison still standing by the gate. He had witnessed everything, her defiance, her humiliation, her moment of desperate courage. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. It wasn't pity or disapproval. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who had also been broken by the machinery of civilization, who had also learned that sometimes the only choice left was to fight, even when fighting meant losing everything. The sun was setting now, painting the church walls in shades of blood and gold. Father Santos was speaking to her in gentle, worried tones, but his words seemed to come from very far away. All she could think about was the turquoise bead in her pocket, warm against her fingers, and the look in Jack Morrison's eyes that promised she was not as alone as she had believed. As the crowd dispersed and the shadows lengthened, Aiyana felt the weight of what she had done settling on her shoulders. She had declared war on the only life she had known, and she had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt truly alive. The medicine pouch beneath her dress seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, carrying the prayers of grandmothers and the dreams of a girl who refused to disappear. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, not as the project they wanted her to be, but as the person she had always been inside. The night air was thick with the scent of sage and impending rain when Jack Morrison found himself standing at the edge of San Miguel's small cemetery. He hadn't meant to come here, had been walking the streets to clear his head when his feet had led him to this place of weathered wooden crosses and careful stone markers. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light over the graves and the single cottonwood tree that stood sentinel over the dead. He wasn't alone. A small figure sat beneath the tree, knees drawn up, face turned toward the stars. Even in the moonlight, he recognized Aiyana's silhouette. She didn't look up when he approached, but he could see the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. "Figured you'd be locked up in the church after what happened today," he said quietly, settling onto the ground a respectful distance away. "Father Santos thinks I'm praying for forgiveness in my room," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't know about the loose board in the floor or the way sound carries through the old walls." Jack nodded, understanding. He'd learned plenty about escaping through windows and loose boards during his own troubled youth. "You hear them planning your future? Mrs. Whitmore's already written her letter. The wagon comes for me in 3 days." Her voice was steady, but Jack could hear the fear beneath it. "She's very pleased with herself, says I'll finally learn proper Christian submission." The word hung between them like a curse. Jack had seen what that kind of submission looked like, had been part of the machine that created it. His hands clenched involuntarily, and he forced himself to breathe slowly. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally, "about who I used to be, about why I can't just ride away from this." Aiyana turned to look at him then, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I know who you were," she said simply. "I knew the moment I saw you. The way you carry yourself, the way you flinch when children cry. You were cavalry." The words hit him like a physical blow. He had thought he'd hidden it better, had believed his guilt was invisible to everyone but himself. "How long have you known?" "Since the first day. My grandmother taught me to read men's souls in their movements. You move like a man who's done things he can't forgive himself for." She paused, studying his face. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with words he'd never spoken aloud. "I was at Sand Creek," he said finally, "and Pine Ridge. I told myself I was following orders, that I was keeping the peace, but I knew, God help me, I knew what we were really doing." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke. Aiyana's expression didn't change, but he saw something shift in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but a kind of weary understanding. "My family was killed in a raid outside Taos," she said. "Cavalry, with a local guide who knew where to find us. I was gathering berries when I heard the gunshots. By the time I ran back, it was over." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Jack could hear the careful control it took to keep it that way. "I hid in the rocks for 2 days before Father Santos found me." "Jesus," Jack breathed. "Aiyana, you weren't there," she said firmly. "I would have remembered your face, but you were part of the same machine, weren't you? The same system that decided we were problems to be solved." He nodded, unable to speak around the knot in his throat. They sat in silence for a while, two people bound together by the weight of history and the strange alchemy of shared understanding. "Why did you help me with the broom?" she asked eventually. Jack considered the question carefully. "Because I saw you standing there, proud and angry and trying not to show it, and I remembered what it felt like to be powerless. Because I've spent 2 years trying to figure out how to live with what I've done, and maybe helping you was the first right thing I've done in a long time." A coyote called from somewhere in the distance, its voice lonely and wild. Aiyana tilted her head, listening, and for a moment Jack saw past the rough cotton dress and the careful submission to the woman she truly was. Someone who belonged to the vast sky and the endless horizon, not to the small confines of other people's expectations. "They're going to come for me tomorrow night," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore doesn't want to wait for the scheduled wagon. She's arranged for Sheriff Brennan to escort me to Santa Fe personally. Says it's for my own protection." "You could run," Jack said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew how hollow they sounded. "Head into the desert. Try to reach your people." "What people?" Aiyana's laugh was bitter. "The ones who survived the raids are scattered across 3 territories. The ones who didn't." She gestured toward the cemetery around them. "Besides, they'd hunt me down within a week. You know they would." Jack did know. He'd been part of those hunts, had tracked runaways across miles of unforgiving terrain. The thought made his stomach turn. There might be another way, he said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. Something that would keep you here, give you legal protection they couldn't challenge. What do you mean? Jack took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to propose would change everything for both of them. Marriage. If you were married to a white man, even one with a questionable past, they couldn't send you away. You'd have legal standing, protection under territorial law. Aiyana stared at him, her expression unreadable. You're talking about a business arrangement. I'm talking about freedom, Jack said. For both of us. You'd be safe from the school, from Mrs. Whitmore's plans. And I'd have a chance to do something right for once. And what would you get out of it? The question was fair, and Jack considered it carefully. Maybe a chance to sleep through the night without dreaming about children screaming. Maybe a purpose that doesn't involve running from town to town, trying to outrun my own shadow. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Aiyana stood up, brushing dust from her dress. It's a crazy idea, she said. Yeah, it is. It would cause a scandal. The whole town would turn against us. Probably. Mrs. Whitmore would make our lives hell. She's already doing that. Aiyana looked down at him, her face serious in the moonlight. You understand what you're offering? You'd be tied to someone the town sees as less than human. Your reputation, your future. My reputation's already shot, Jack interrupted. And my future, well, I wasn't planning on much of one anyway. The rain was falling harder now, pattering against the cottonwood leaves like scattered applause. Aiyana held out her hand, and Jack took it, letting her help him to his feet. Her fingers were small and strong, calloused from years of hard work. I need to think about it, she said. This isn't just about me, it's about what kind of life we'd be choosing, what kind of battle we'd be fighting. I know. Jack squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. But Aiyana, whatever you decide, I want you to know you're not alone in this, not anymore. She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing me, for helping me remember who I am. As they hurried back toward the church, the rain falling harder with each step, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a man trying to escape his past, but the steady, determined hope of someone who had finally found a reason to fight for the future. Behind them, the cemetery lay quiet under the rain, its weathered crosses marking the places where other dreams had been buried. But tonight, in the space between the living and the dead, two people had found each other in the darkness and chosen to believe that tomorrow might be different than yesterday. The storm was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, Jack Morrison wasn't afraid of the thunder. The morning sun had barely crested the Sangre de Cristo Mountains when Sheriff Tom Brennan knocked on the door of Jack Morrison's small room above the livery stable. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the air clean and sharp, but the tension in San Miguel was thicker than ever. Need to talk to you, Morrison, Brennan said when Jack opened the door, his weathered face grim. Official business. Jack had been expecting this visit. He'd seen the way conversations stopped when he walked by yesterday, felt the weight of stares and whispered speculation. He gestured for the sheriff to come in, noting how Brennan's hand rested casually on his gun belt, not threatening, but ready. Coffee? Jack offered, though his small room barely had space for two men to stand. This isn't a social call. Brennan's voice was tired. I've got concerns about your involvement with the Indian girl at the church. Her name is Aiyana. I know what her name is. Brennan's eyes narrowed. What I don't know is what you think you're doing. Mrs. Whitmore says you've been bothering her, filling her head with ideas. Jack poured himself coffee from the pot on his small stove, taking his time with the ritual. Mrs. Whitmore says a lot of things, most of them designed to make herself feel important. Watch your tongue, Morrison. That's the mayor's wife you're talking about. Brennan shifted his weight, and Jack could see the conflict in the man's face. Look, I don't give a damn about your personal business, but this is a small town. People talk, and when they talk, they get ideas. Bad ideas. What kind of ideas? The kind that end with someone getting hurt. Brennan's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work. That girl is under the church's protection. She's got no family, no rights, no legal standing. If something were to happen to her, something like what? Brennan was quiet for a long moment, studying Jack's face. You know what I'm talking about. Don't play dumb with me. I've seen your type before. Men carrying guilt, looking for redemption in all the wrong places. The accusation hit closer to home than Jack cared to admit. And what type is that, Sheriff? The type that thinks saving one person will balance the scales for all the others. Brennan's voice was not unkind, but it was firm. It doesn't work that way, Morrison. You can't fix the past by stirring up trouble in the present. Jack set down his coffee cup and turned to face the sheriff fully. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to move on, today, before this situation gets any worse. Brennan's hand moved slightly on his gun belt. There's a wagon train forming up in Las Vegas. They could use an extra gun for the journey to Colorado. I can put in a word for you. And if I refuse, then I'll have to consider you a threat to the peace of this community. The words were spoken quietly, but their meaning was clear, and I take threats to the peace very seriously. Jack considered his options. He could fight. He was still quick with a gun, despite everything, but that would only prove Brennan's point about trouble. He could run, which was what he'd been doing for 2 years anyway, or he could stand his ground and trust that Aiyana would make the right choice when the time came. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, Jack said finally, but I think I'll stay a while longer. This town's starting to grow on me. Brennan's expression darkened. That's your final answer? It is. The sheriff nodded curtly and moved toward the door. Then I hope you know what you're doing, Morrison, because if this goes bad, I won't be able to protect you from what comes next. After Brennan left, Jack sat on his narrow bed and stared out the window at the church across the square. He could see Aiyana sweeping the steps again, the same ritual that had brought them together. But today there were more people watching than usual. Mrs. Whitmore stood in the doorway of the general store, her face set in hard lines. A group of men lounged outside the saloon, their conversation animated and their glances pointed. The town was choosing sides, and Jack had a sinking feeling about which side would have more supporters. Around noon, Father Santos appeared at his door, his round face creased with worry. "Mr. Morrison, might I have a word?" This time Jack invited him in and offered coffee, which the priest accepted gratefully. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Father Santos spoke. "I understand you've been speaking with Aiyana." "I have." "Might I ask about the nature of these conversations?" Jack studied the priest's face, looking for signs of malice or manipulation. What he saw instead was genuine concern for Aiyana, for the town, for the delicate balance that kept everyone from each other's throats. "She's a remarkable young woman," Jack said carefully. "Strong, intelligent, brave. She deserves better than what she's been given." "I agree," Father Santos said, surprising him. "But the world is not always just, Mr. Morrison. Sometimes we must work within the system we have, rather than fighting against it. And sometimes the system is wrong." The priest was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I came here from Mexico 20 years ago," he said finally. "I've seen what happens when cultures clash, when people refuse to find common ground. Violence, Mr. Morrison. Always violence. So you'd rather see her spirit crushed than risk a fight?" "I'd rather see her alive and whole than dead and martyred." Father Santos's voice was sharp. "You think you're the first man to be moved by her plight. There have been others. Young men from the Pueblo who tried to help her escape. Mexican vaqueros who thought they could ride in and save her. Where do you think they are now?" Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What happened to them?" "They're buried in that cemetery where you and Aiyana had your conversation last night." Father Santos met his eyes steadily. "Yes, I know about that too. There are no secrets in a town this size." The priest stood up, setting down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. "I like you, Mr. Morrison. You're a decent man trying to do right by a situation that has no right answers. But if you truly care about Aiyana, you'll find another way to help her. One that doesn't end with both of you dead." After the priest left, Jack sat alone with his thoughts and the weight of unwelcome knowledge. He understood now why Aiyana had seemed so resigned to her fate, why she'd spoken of running as if it were impossible. It wasn't just the law that kept her trapped. It was the unspoken threat of violence that hung over anyone who dared to challenge the established order. The afternoon dragged on, and Jack found himself watching the church from his window like a man obsessed. He saw Aiyana going about her duties, saw the way people looked at her, some with pity, some with suspicion, all with the casual dismissal reserved for those deemed less than fully human. As the sun began to set, painting the adobe walls in shades of gold and crimson, Jack made his decision. He strapped on his gun belt for the first time in weeks, checked his revolver, and walked downstairs to saddle his horse. If they were going to treat him like a threat anyway, he might as well earn it. The church was quiet when he arrived, most of the townspeople having retired for their evening meals. He found Aiyana in the garden, pulling weeds by lamplight. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and he saw the decision in her eyes before she spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she said quietly. About marriage, about legal protection. And I think you're right. She stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. But there's something you need to know first. Father Santos told me about the others, the men who tried to help me before. They're all dead, Jack. Every one of them. Jack nodded grimly. The priest mentioned something about that. And you're still here. I'm still here. Aiyana studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something. Courage, maybe, or the kind of stubborn determination that had gotten him this far. Why? Because some things are worth fighting for, Jack said simply. Because you're worth fighting for, and because I'm tired of being the kind of man who walks away when things get hard. She smiled then, sad and beautiful and brave. Then I guess we'd better get married. Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm building over the mountains. But this time Jack Morrison was ready for whatever came next. The wedding took place at dawn, with only Father Santos as witness and the morning mist rising from the Rio Grande Valley like incense. Jack had roused the priest from his bed an hour before sunrise, knowing that once the town awakened, their window of opportunity would close forever. "Are you certain about this?" Father Santos asked for the third time, as he prepared the simple ceremony in the church's small side chapel. His hands shook slightly as he arranged the worn prayer book and crude wooden cross. "Once the words are spoken, there will be no taking them back." "We're certain," Aiyana said firmly. She had traded her rough work dress for the simple white cotton gown that Father Santos kept for such occasions. Too large for her small frame, but clean and proper. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and in the candlelight she looked both younger and older than her 16 years. Jack stood beside her in his cleanest shirt and only jacket, his hat in his hands. He had shaved carefully by lamplight, wanting to look respectable for what might be the most important moment of either of their lives. The gun belt around his waist seemed incongruous with the sacred setting, but he refused to remove it. Not today. "Do you, John Morrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." Jack's voice was steady, his grey eyes meeting Aiyana's dark ones. In them he saw not love, not yet, but trust, and perhaps that was more valuable. "Do you, Aiyana?" Father Santos paused, realizing he had never learned her family name. In the church records, she was simply listed as Indian girl, orphaned. "Aiyana Yazzie," she said quietly, speaking her grandmother's clan name for the first time in 2 years. "Aiyana Yazzie of the Pueblo people." Father Santos nodded and continued, "Do you, Aiyana Yazzie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." The words hung in the quiet air of the chapel like a prayer. Father Santos made the sign of the cross and spoke the final blessing, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and the hope of redemption. "By the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Jack took Aiyana's hands in his, small, calloused hands that had endured too much but remained gentle. "We did it," he whispered. "We did." Her smile was radiant in the candlelight. "Mrs. Aiyana Morrison. It has a nice sound." Father Santos quickly filled out the marriage certificate, his pen scratching across the official paper that would serve as their shield against the storm to come. "You'll need to register this with the territorial authorities in Santa Fe," he said, sealing the document with wax. "The sooner the better." Outside, the church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to morning prayers. But this morning the sound seemed different, not summoning people to worship, but announcing the arrival of something new and unexpected. They had perhaps an hour before Mrs. Whitmore discovered what had happened, an hour before the town erupted in outrage and disbelief, an hour to prepare for the battle that would surely follow. "I've packed some supplies," Father Santos said quietly, handing Jack a canvas bag. "Food, water, ammunition. There's a place in the hills north of town, an old line shack that the vaqueros use during roundup. You could stay there until things settle down." "We're not running," Aiyana said firmly. "I've been running all my life, hiding who I am, pretending to be grateful for scraps of kindness. Not anymore." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "She's right, Father. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. We'll face whatever comes together." The priest looked troubled, but nodded. "Then may God protect you both. You'll need all the help you can get." They walked out of the church together as the sun crested the mountains, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and rose. The main street was still quiet, but smoke was beginning to rise from chimneys as the town stirred to life. Jack helped Aiyana onto his horse, and they rode slowly toward the center of town, making no attempt to hide their presence. The first person to see them was old Miguel Herrera, sweeping the front of his cantina. He dropped his broom and crossed himself, staring at them as if they were apparitions. By the time they reached the general store, a small crowd had gathered. Early risers on their way to work, pausing to gawk at the impossible sight of the church's servant girl riding beside the notorious drifter. "Spread the word," Jack called out to them, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. Aiyana, Yazzie and Jack Morrison were married this morning by Father Santos, legal and proper, witnessed and recorded. The crowd buzzed with shocked murmurs. Mrs. Whitmore emerged from the store, still in her dressing gown, her face cycling through disbelief, outrage and cold fury. "This is impossible," she declared. "The girl is a ward of the church. She has no legal right to marry without permission." "She's 18 years old," Jack lied smoothly, knowing that Aiyana's actual age was recorded nowhere officially. "Old enough to make her own choices under territorial law." "I don't believe it." Mrs. Whitmore's voice rose to a screech. "Sheriff Brennan! Sheriff Brennan, come quickly!" But Tom Brennan was already walking toward them from the jail, his face grim but resigned. Behind him came Mayor Whitmore, several prominent townsmen, and a growing crowd of curious onlookers. The confrontation Jack had been preparing for was finally at hand. "Morning, Sheriff," Jack said calmly. "Beautiful day for a wedding." Brennan stopped a few feet away, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Let me see the certificate." Jack handed over the document, watching as Brennan examined it carefully. The sheriff's expression revealed nothing, but Jack could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, calculating angles, considering options, weighing the cost of different courses of action. "Looks legal," Brennan said finally, handing the paper back. "Signed, witnessed, properly recorded." "Legal." Mrs. Whitmore's voice reached a pitch that made nearby horses skitter nervously. That savage has no right to marry a white man. It's against God and nature." "Actually, ma'am," Brennan said wearily, "territorial law is pretty clear on this point. Marriage between races isn't illegal in New Mexico, long as both parties are of age and consent freely." The crowd erupted in angry voices, some supporting Mrs. Whitmore's outrage, others arguing for law and order, a few quietly voicing approval for the young couple's courage. Jack could feel the tension building like steam in a kettle, ready to explode into violence. "This won't stand," Mayor Whitmore declared, stepping forward. "I'll write to the territorial governor, to the Indian Affairs Office. This marriage is a mockery, and it will be annulled." "On what grounds?" Aiyana spoke for the first time since they'd left the church, her voice clear and strong. "I freely consented to marry this man. I was not coerced, not threatened, not deceived. By what right do you claim authority over my choices?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing for the first time that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A young native woman claiming her own agency, demanding to be treated as a full human being with rights and choices. "By the right of Christian civilization," Mrs. Whitmore snapped, "by the right of those who understand what's best for your immortal soul." "My soul is my own," Aiyana replied firmly, "as is my life, my heart, and my future, and I choose to share them with this man." Jack felt a surge of pride and admiration for his new wife. She sat straight in the saddle, facing down the entire power structure of the town, with quiet dignity and unshakable resolve. This was the woman he had glimpsed beneath the layers of forced submission, proud, intelligent, brave beyond measure. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by an unexpected voice from the back of the crowd. "Good for you, girl." The speaker was Maria Santos, the blacksmith's wife, a Mexican woman who had endured her own share of prejudice from the Anglo establishment. About time someone stood up to these busybodies. Her words seemed to break a dam. Other voices joined in, some supporting the marriage, others condemning it, all of them loud and passionate. The crowd began to fracture along lines that had always existed, but had never been spoken aloud. Sheriff Brennan held up his hand for silence. "That's enough," he said firmly. "The marriage is legal whether we like it or not. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison have every right to be here, and anyone who threatens them will answer to me." It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but it was protection under law. Jack touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. "Appreciate that, Sheriff." Mrs. Whitmore looked as if she might explode. "This isn't over," she declared. "Mark my words, this unholy union will bring nothing but trouble to our community." "Maybe," Jack said calmly. "Or maybe it'll help folks remember that we're all human beings trying to make our way in a hard world. Maybe it'll remind people that love and respect don't depend on the color of your skin or where your grandparents were born." As the crowd began to disperse, some people still muttering angrily, while others nodded thoughtfully, Jack and Aiyana rode slowly back toward the church. They had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. There would be more challenges, more confrontations, more people trying to tear apart what they had built, but they would face them together. Father Santos was waiting for them in the church courtyard, his face creased with worry, and something that might have been pride. "So," he said as they dismounted, "how did it go?" "Better than expected," Aiyana said, taking Jack's arm as they walked toward the church. "Though Mrs. Whitmore looked ready to summon the entire U.S. Army." "She probably will," the priest said with a rueful smile. "But for now you're safe and legal and—" He paused, studying their faces, "and perhaps happier than either of you expected to be." Jack looked down at his wife, and saw the truth of those words reflected in her eyes. They had started this as a marriage of convenience, a strategic alliance against a hostile world. But somewhere in the space between the I-do's and the confrontation with the town, something real had begun to grow between them. "Father," Aiyana said suddenly, "I have a favor to ask." "Of course, my child. I'd like to sweep the church steps one more time, but not as a servant, as a free woman choosing to help care for God's house." Father Santos smiled, the first genuine smile Jack had seen from him since this whole affair began. "I think that would be very appropriate, Mrs. Morrison." As the sun climbed higher and the morning mist burned away, Jack and Aiyana stood together on the church steps, the same steps where their story had begun just a week ago. This time, they swept side by side as equals, partners in a marriage that might have started as necessity, but was already becoming something more. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain and challenging. There would be difficulties, legal battles, social ostracism, the constant pressure of a society that refused to accept their union. But they would face it all together, two people who had found in each other not just protection and companionship, but the possibility of healing and hope. The church bells rang out over the valley, calling the faithful to worship. But Jack Morrison and Aiyana Yazzie Morrison had already found their sanctuary, in each other, in their shared determination to build something better than what had come before, and in the quiet revolution of choosing love over fear. As they finished their work and prepared to enter the church for their first Sunday service as husband and wife, Aiyana paused and looked back at the town spreading out below them. "Do you think we can really make this work?" she asked quietly. Jack followed her gaze, taking in the scattered buildings, the mountains beyond, and the vast sky that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. "I think we already have," he said, taking her hand. "Everything else is just details." Together they walked into the church, ready to face whatever came next, not as the Indian ward and the guilty drifter, but as two people who had chosen to write their own story in a world that insisted on writing it for them. The morning sun streamed through the church windows, painting everything in golden light, and for the first time in years, both Jack and Aiyana Morrison felt truly free.